The rejection didn't feel like heartbreak. It felt like someone had pried two ribs apart and left them that way, slow enough that Bianca felt every fiber tear. Aaron was already turning his back on her. She stayed on her knees on the frost-bitten stone because her legs had simply stopped answering her. Somewhere behind her, a noblewoman laughed into her sleeve. Closer. A man muttered that the moon goddess must have been drunk on blood wine to pair the future king with a border scout. The laughter spread. Ugly, delighted, the sound wolves made once they'd decided who tonight's prey would be. Then, all at once, it stopped. Not faded. Stopped. Like a hand had closed around every throat in the courtyard in the same instant. Bianca heard the reason before she understood it. Boots on stone, unhurried, each footfall heavy enough that she felt it climb up through her palms. She lifted her head. He wasn't looking at his brother. He was looking at her. 20 minutes earlier, none of this had seemed possible. The courtyard of Blackthorn Keep was thick with the smell of roasting boar, torch smoke, and the damp musk of too many wolves crowded inside stone walls. Banners bearing the silver wolf of House Blackthorn snapped between the towers, in a wind that already smelled like snow. Overhead, the blood moon climbed red and swollen above the battlements, and beneath it, the whole kingdom had gathered for the night of choosing. For the older packs, it was a night for ale and old war stories, a chance to stand near the fire pits and pretend the cold didn't reach their bones anymore. For every unwed wolf under 30, it meant something sharper. Tonight was the night the moon goddess chose who they would spend their life beside, and by ancient law, every one of them stood in that courtyard to find out, noble and common alike. No one was permitted to hide from fate. Bianca had always thought that particular law was less about honoring the goddess and more about giving the nobles something to gossip about. Bianca stood near the back, where the torchlight didn't quite reach. She hadn't dressed for it, because there had been nothing to dress for. Her leathers were patched at the knee, her boots still caked with mud from the northern border, where she spent most of her life tracking raiders through country no noble had ever set foot in. A hunting knife sat against her hip, not for show. She was an orphan, the daughter of a scout who'd died defending a village nobody important lived in, and she'd learned young that nobody in silk was coming to save her. Across the courtyard, on the raised dais, stood Aaron, heir to Blackthorn, golden and precise, already flanked by Lady Lisa, whose father owned half the Western Territories, and whose silver gown probably cost more than every roof in Bianca's border village combined. Everyone assumed the pairing was a formality, a bond the goddess would simply confirm because it was convenient. Aaron certainly did. He hadn't so much as glanced toward the back of the crowd all night. Bianca hadn't expected to feel anything at all. She'd come because the law demanded it, planned to slip out the moment the ceremony ended, and go back to a life that made sense. Then the scent hit her. Pine smoke, rain-soaked earth, something warm, like burning amber. Bianca's pulse slammed once against her throat. Across the courtyard, Aaron went rigid. The bond between them snapped taut like a rope pulled from both ends, and the whole courtyard felt it happen. Gasps broke out in waves. The goddess has chosen. It can't be her. The prince's mate is a scout? Hundreds of eyes turned as her feet carried her forward into the open, and for one foolish heartbeat, hope moved through her chest. Not because she wanted a crown, because no wolf, not even a prince, could refuse what the goddess had tied. She was wrong. Aaron looked at her the way a man looks at mud tracked across his floor. He took in the patched leathers, the knife, the dirt she hadn't had time to scrub from her hands, and something in his face curdled into disgust. Then he laughed. Is this the goddess's idea of a joke? His voice carried to every corner of the courtyard. My mate? A border scout? The nobles laughed with him. Bianca stopped 3 feet away, chin lifted even as her stomach dropped through the stones. I didn't ask for this. Neither did I. Aaron stepped onto the dais so no one could miss it. I, Aaron of Blackthorn, reject Bianca before my entire kingdom. I reject this bond. The words found the gap between her ribs like a blade finding the seam in armor. She went down onto the stone. The laughter rose again, and this time it didn't stop. Not even when Aaron crossed to Lady Lisa and took her hand instead, announcing to the whole courtyard that his kingdom needed strength, not pity. Lisa's smile was small and satisfied, the smile of a woman who'd just watched a problem solve itself. Bianca knelt in the cold and tried to remember how breathing worked. She forced herself upright. If she stayed down one more second, she wasn't sure she'd get back up at all. She turned toward the gates, toward anywhere that wasn't here. That was when the footsteps started. Every noble in the courtyard bowed at once. Even Aaron lowered his head. Alpha King Matt crossed the stones like he owned the ground beneath them, because in Blackthorn he did. Where Aaron was polish and gold, his older brother was old iron and scar tissue, a jagged line cutting through one eyebrow, gray threading through dark hair, black armor beaten from battles his younger brother had never fought a day of. He wasn't handsome. Not the way Aaron was handsome. He was something closer to a verdict. The kind of man rooms went quiet for even when he said nothing at all. He didn't stop at the dais. He didn't so much as glance at his brother. And Aaron's jaw tightened like he felt the slight anyway. Matt walked straight through the parting crowd until he stood over Bianca, boots inches from her trembling hands, and the entire courtyard held its breath to see what the king would do with the woman his brother had just thrown away like scraps to the dogs. Bianca braced herself for pity. Pity would have been worse than the rejection. Instead, Matt crouched until his golden eyes were level with hers, and for a moment neither of them moved. Whatever he was looking for, he seemed to find it. In the set of her jaw, in the fact that she was still on her feet at all, in the tears she refused to let fall any further. "Look at me," he said. Bianca lifted her chin, because refusing to obey felt like the only power she had left. Matt's golden eyes moved over her face like he was reading a report. Not the wet eyes, not the trembling mouth she was fighting to still, but the fact that she was still upright, still breathing, still meeting his stare instead of the stones. "You stood," he said, like it meant something. "I didn't have anywhere else to fall." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she hated it for cracking. Something flickered behind his eyes. Not pity, recognition. He'd seen wolves twice her size crumble under half of what she'd just survived. Most people, rejected in front of their entire kingdom, curled inward and let the crowd finish the job. She hadn't curled. She'd tried to walk out the gates on her own two legs, and that, more than the bond, seemed to be what had brought him across the courtyard. He rose to his full height, and only then did he turn toward his brother, and the temperature of the entire courtyard seemed to drop with him. "You rejected the moon goddess," Matt said. Aaron's jaw tightened. "I rejected weakness." "No." The word cracked across the stones like a whip. "You rejected the strongest wolf standing in this courtyard tonight." A ripple moved through the crowd. Aaron's hands curled into fists at his sides. "Brother, you chose beauty over courage." Matt took a step toward the dais. "You chose politics over instinct. You chose silk." His eyes cut, briefly, contemptuously, to Lisa's gown. "Over steel." Lady Lisa's mouth fell open. She tracked raiders through the northern passes alone, before she was old enough to drink, Matt went on. She buried her own father because no one else would, and you looked at the mud on her boots and decided that was all there was to see. Aaron said nothing. For the first time since Bianca had known his name, he looked young. "This changes nothing," Aaron said finally, though his voice had lost its certainty. "She's still a scout, and you're still my brother," Matt said. "That's the only reason I haven't stripped you of your title on this stone tonight." Matt turned back to the courtyard, and when he spoke again, his voice carried to the furthest banner on the furthest wall. "If my brother refuses the woman fate has chosen, I will not let fate go unanswered in my kingdom." He reached down, his hand closed around Bianca's, warm and enormous, and steadier than anything else had been in the last 10 minutes of her life. "I, Matt, Alpha King of Blackthorn, claim Bianca as my mate." The courtyard didn't gasp this time. It broke. Nobles shouted over one another. Outrage, disbelief, someone near the back laughing before the sound died fast under Matt's turned head. A handful of older warriors, the ones with scars of their own, went quiet instead, watching Bianca with something closer to appraisal than anger. Lady Lisa went white, then red, her hands twisting into her own skirts like she wanted to tear them. Aaron stood frozen at the edge of the dais, staring at his brother's hand wrapped around Bianca's, as though he couldn't make his mind agree with what his eyes were showing him. "She is your queen," Matt said. "From this day forward. Anyone with a quarrel over that can bring it to me." No one did. Bianca barely felt her own feet as Matt led her from the dais, through a crowd that parted like water around a blade. She registered the cold air, the banners snapping overhead, the weight of hundreds of eyes she couldn't bring herself to meet. She didn't register until the noise of the courtyard finally fell away behind them, that she'd been holding her breath the entire time. The corridors of the keep were narrower than she'd expected for a king's. Torchlit, quiet, the roar of the courtyard fading into something distant and unreal, like a nightmare already losing its shape. Matt didn't speak again until they reached a set of heavy oak doors carved with the blackthorn wolf. The guards on either side bowed without a flicker of surprise, as if their king, claiming a border scout in front of the entire nobility, were simply another Tuesday. He pushed the doors open. The room beyond was larger than the hunting lodge she'd grown up in. A hearth already lit, furs laid across the floor, a window looking out over the black line of northern mountains she knew better than anyone in this castle ever would. She should have felt saved. Instead, she stood in the doorway, turning the last hour over in her mind, looking for the version of it that made sense. A king didn't cross a courtyard for a stranger. A king protected his crown, his bloodline, the law that kept nobles from tearing each other apart over broken bonds. She was a fix, a convenient one, wearing a mate bond he hadn't asked for either. "You'll stay here," Matt said. "No one touches you under this roof." Bianca stood in the doorway and made herself say it before her nerve went. "You didn't do that for me." He didn't deny it fast enough. "You did it to save face," she said. "To prove the goddess's law still means something, in front of every noble house that was about to start whispering about a broken bond." Her hands had curled at her sides without her noticing. "I'm not stupid, my lord. I know what I am to you right now. A correction. A message." Matt studied her for a long moment, firelight carving the scar down his face into something almost gentle. "Believe that, if it's easier," he said quietly. She held his gaze and refused to let it be that simple. "Why did you really choose me?" Matt didn't answer. He held her gaze a moment longer, then gave her a short nod, not quite a bow, more the acknowledgement one soldier gives another, and left her alone with the fire and the mountains and a question that would keep her awake long after the candles burned down. By morning, she still didn't have an answer. What she had instead was a knock at her door before she'd finished dressing, and Matt standing in the hall looking like he hadn't slept either. "Walk with me," he said. He led her through corridors she hadn't seen the night before, past tapestries of wolves locked in old battles, until they reached a balcony overlooking the training yard, where warriors were already sparring in the cold. "My father believed a queen's only purpose was to look beautiful beside the throne," Matt said, watching the yard below. "He married my mother for her bloodline, then left her to embroider tapestries while he fought wars he should have brought her into. And you don't agree. Queens are not ornaments." He said it like something carved into stone, not an opinion. "I need someone who survives when the throne is under attack, not someone who decorates it while it burns." Bianca studied him. So this is a job interview. Something that might have been the ghost of a smile touched his mouth. "Everything in this castle is a job interview. You'll learn that quickly." "And the scar?" She nodded toward the line cutting through his eyebrow. "Was that a job interview too? That was a mistake I made at 19, trusting a man who smiled too easily." His eyes stayed on the yard below. "I don't make it twice. Smiles are cheap here. Silk is cheaper. I'd rather build my kingdom on people who've bled for something." It was the closest he'd come to answering last night's question, and they both seemed to know it. The servants he introduced her to next didn't bow so much as brace, unsure whether the new queen expected the same reverence as the old rules demanded. An older woman named Mira, gray-haired and unimpressed by titles, was the only one who looked Bianca straight in the eye. "You've got calluses," Mira said, taking her hand without asking permission first. "Didn't expect that from a queen. I like you already." Word travels fast in a castle. By the time Bianca crossed the great hall, clusters of noble ladies had already arranged themselves to be seen not looking at her, which was its own kind of insult. Someone murmured, "Border trash," just loud enough to carry. Someone else laughed behind a fan and asked, not quietly enough, whether the new queen knew which fork was for fish. Bianca kept walking. She'd survived worse whispers on the northern trail, usually from things with teeth. A young guard at the hall's far door straightened as she passed, and instead of the polite blankness the others gave her, he actually met her eyes and dipped his head. Small, almost nothing, but she felt it land somewhere it hadn't before. Lisa found her an hour later, trailed by 2 seamstresses and a rack of gowns in silk so fine it looked liquid. A gift, Lisa said, sweet as poisoned honey, for the new queen. We couldn't let you attend council dressed like— Her eyes swept over Bianca's leathers. The gowns were beautiful. They were also useless. Corsets boned stiff enough to crack ribs, skirts too heavy to run in, sleeves that would snag on a drawn bowstring. Bianca understood the trap instantly. Wear them, and be humiliated when she couldn't move, or refuse them, and be branded ungrateful. Thank you, Bianca said, but I'll keep my own. Lisa's smile thinned to a blade's edge. A queen can't greet foreign envoys smelling like a tannery, darling. A queen can't defend her kingdom in a corset that won't let her draw breath, either. Bianca ran a hand over her worn leather sleeve. I'll take my chances with the tannery. Whatever makes you comfortable, Scout. Lisa swept off with her seamstresses trailing behind her like ducklings, but the set of her shoulders said the exchange hadn't gone the way she'd planned. Bianca wore her old leathers to council that evening, cleaned, but unmistakably hers. The room went quiet when she walked in. Matt's eyes passed over her once, down and back up, unreadable, and he said nothing at all. It took her a moment to understand that the silence was approval. The court noticed, too. Whispers followed her to the table, softer this time, not mockery anymore, something closer to recalculation. Sit, Matt said, nodding to the chair at his right hand, the seat tradition reserved for the king's most trusted advisor. Aaron, 3 seats down, went rigid. An older general opened his mouth to object, and thought better of it under Matt's stare. She stays, Matt said, before anyone could ask. Anyone who doubts why can ask her about the northern passes. No one asked. The council turned to grain stores and border patrols, the dull machinery of a kingdom that mostly ran itself. Bianca listened more than she spoke, memorizing names and rivalries, aware of Aaron's eyes on her from 3 seats down, like a wound that hadn't closed. The doors slammed open before anyone had finished the second report. A scout staggered in, mud splattered, breathing hard, blood crusted along one arm. My king. He dropped to one knee. The eastern border. We're under attack. The scout's report hung in the air a heartbeat before the room exploded into motion. Matt was already at the war table, snapping orders that scattered aides toward the armory and the stables. Maps unrolled across the oak, held flat at the corners by daggers instead of weights. Torches guttered as the doors kept opening and closing. Generals pouring in half-dressed, still buckling armor they'd grabbed from their own quarters. Bianca stayed in her seat, studying the eastern border sketched in faded ink, memorizing the terrain the way she memorized everything, like her life might depend on it, because it usually did. Aaron was the first to speak with any confidence. 500 warriors through the eastern pass by dawn. He dragged a finger straight through the valley on the map. We hit them before they've finished setting camp. Fast, direct, decisive. The generals murmured approval, the particular grunt of old soldiers nodding along to a plan that flattered their instincts. It was the obvious route. It was also, Bianca realized with a cold drop in her stomach, exactly the kind of obvious that got armies killed. That valley floods every spring, she said. The room didn't so much quiet as freeze, every head turning toward the seat no one had expected to hear from. Aaron's mouth curled. This isn't a border patrol, Scout. This is war. I know what war looks like. Her voice didn't rise, but it didn't shrink either. I've walked that valley in flood season. The ground won't hold 500 men. It holds mud to the knee, and cliffs on both sides that no one bothers defending, because nobody sane marches through it. A general laughed, short and ugly. And what would a tracker know about strategy? More than a man who's never had to survive being wrong. Someone snorted. Someone else muttered about scouts playing general, and a third suggested, not quietly enough, that perhaps the king's new queen should keep to needlework and leave the war to men who'd actually fought one. Bianca felt the heat climb her neck and made herself hold still, because flinching now would hand them exactly what they wanted. Then Matt's voice cut through all of it, low and final. Explain. The room's attention swung to him, then to her. Bianca rose and crossed to the map. They're not defending the valley because they don't need to, she said. The cliffs do that for them. March 500 men through there and you're walking into a kill box. No footing, no room to swing a blade, nowhere to run when they drop on you from above. Her finger traced a thin line above the valley floor. But there's a goat trail here, above the flood line, narrow, easy to miss if you're not looking for it. It comes out directly over whatever staging ground they've built, because that's where I'd stage an army too. High, dry, out of the mud, silence. How do you know they're staged there and not somewhere else? A general asked, though the sharpness had drained out of his voice. Because it's the only flat, dry ground within 2 days' march that isn't already somebody's village. I'd bet my life on it. She paused. I have, before, tracking raiders through that exact country. She tapped the ridgeline once more, and if I'm wrong, you lose nothing but a day's march. If Aaron's wrong, you lose 500 men in a valley with nowhere to bury them. No one had an answer for that. Matt studied the map, then her, for a long moment. We take the ridge, he said. Full mobilization. We move within the hour. Aaron's face cycled through several colors before settling on something carefully blank. Brother, with respect, we don't gamble a war on a scout's hunch. It's not a hunch. It's a decade of tracking men through country you've never set foot in. Matt was already moving, already barking orders that sent the room back into motion. Mobilize the men. We go over the mountains, not through the valley. As the generals scattered to their commands, Matt paused beside her just long enough to say, quiet enough that only she could hear it. Good catch. 2 words. It shouldn't have mattered as much as it did. By dawn, Blackthorn's army moved not through the pass but above it, a long, dark line of warriors climbing frozen goat trails Bianca had walked 100 times before anyone here had bothered to learn her name. Breath fogged in the gray light. Below and to their right, the valley waited, silent and empty, and exactly as deadly as she'd promised. A trap, with no one left to spring it. Aaron rode near the rear of the column, jaw tight, watching the back of his brother's head, and, just ahead of it, the woman who'd made him look like a fool in front of every general in the kingdom. He told himself it changed nothing. He told himself the mountain route would fail, that she'd be proven wrong, that the valley would have gotten them there faster. He didn't quite believe it, and underneath the resentment, something colder was already taking root. The quiet certainty that every victory Bianca won for this kingdom would feel, to him, like a defeat aimed squarely at his own name. The mountain trail didn't get easier as the day wore on. It got worse, ice-slicked in the shade, crumbling underfoot in the sun, narrow enough in places that men had to go single file with shields strapped to their backs to keep from overbalancing. Wind cut through leather like it wasn't there. By midday, breath came in ragged clouds, and even the strongest warriors had stopped talking, saving what air they had for the climb. Bianca had crossed harder ground alone before, but never while 400 warriors trusted a scout's memory to keep them alive. Matt fell into step beside her near midday. Watch the column, not the trail, he said, nodding back at the long, crooked line of warriors behind them. A good commander doesn't stare at his own feet. He counts how many men are still climbing at the same pace 3 hours in, and he knows which ones are failing before they know it themselves. Bianca glanced back. Near the rear, a young warrior was falling steadily behind, favoring his left leg. She hadn't noticed until Matt pointed her toward exactly where to look. How do you know where to look? Because someone taught me, the same way I'm teaching you. For a moment, the iron in his voice cracked into something warmer. Command isn't magic. It's just paying attention to the right things. Is that what you were doing? She asked. In the courtyard, paying attention to the right things? He didn't answer that one either, but the look he gave her lasted a beat longer than it needed to. They walked in silence after that, boots crunching frost, until Bianca found the question still sitting in her chest since the war chamber. Why did you really? Ask me again after the battle, not unkindly. I'd rather answer it standing than marching. It wasn't a no. She let herself hold on to that. They reached the ridge above the enemy camp an hour before dawn. Below them, fires burned low and careless. Sentries slouched against their spears. The exact picture of an army that had never once considered being hunted instead of hunting. Matt raised one hand. 400 warriors went still as stone. Then his hand dropped. Blackthorn came off that mountain like the mountain itself had decided to move. The camp dissolved into chaos within seconds. Shouting, steel, men stumbling half-armored out of tents into a fight they'd never see coming. Somewhere ahead, Matt fought at the front of the line where a king was expected to fight, his blade moving with the brutal economy of a man who'd done this 1,000 times before. Bianca stayed close to the command line the way she'd been taught, but training only holds until the world catches fire around you. She saw the blade before the young warrior beside her did, the same one who'd favored his leg on the climb, an enemy sword already swinging for his exposed side. She didn't think. She put her own body between the strike and his, caught the blow on her forearm guard hard enough to rattle her teeth, then drove her knife up under the man's ribs before he found his balance again. The warrior she'd saved stared at her like he was seeing her for the first time. There was no time to say anything. A roar went up nearby. The enemy captain, a mountain of a man in scavenged plate, cutting a path straight toward Matt's banner. Bianca moved before she'd decided to, closing the distance low and fast, the way she closed on Wounded Game, never head-on. She hit his knee from the side with everything she had, and when he buckled, she was already inside his guard, blade finding the gap beneath his arm. He went down hard enough to shake the frozen ground. For one suspended second, the fighting nearest her seemed to slow, warriors catching sight of the border scout standing over a dead captain twice her size. Then the battle swallowed the moment whole. By the time the sun cleared the ridge, it was over. Blackthorn's banners stood over a broken camp, and the same men who'd laughed at Bianca in the war room now couldn't quite meet her eyes. Not from mockery this time, but something closer to reverence. Matt found her in the wreckage, blood on her sleeve that wasn't hers, breathing hard, alive. He didn't say anything right away. He just looked at her the way a man looks at something he's afraid to admit he needs. Whatever question he'd been avoiding on the mountain, Bianca thought, he'd just answered it anyway, without a single word. Neither of them noticed the figure high on the far ridge, folded into the rocks like part of the mountain itself, watching the king and his new queen through the narrow slit of a hood, already calculating which one of them needed to die first. The journey back through the mountains should have felt like a victory march. Instead, 400 warriors picked their way down icy trails in a silence that felt earned rather than peaceful, carrying their dead and their relief in equal measure. Bianca rode near the front now, close enough to Matt that no one bothered questioning it anymore. They were 2 days from Blackthorn Keep, when the world went wrong. It happened fast. The kind of fast that only makes sense afterward, in pieces. A whisper of movement in the rocks above the trail. Aaron, riding a few lengths ahead, laughing at something one of the generals had said, utterly unaware. Bianca saw the angle before she understood what she was seeing. An arrow already loosed, aimed not at the column, not at Matt, but through the unguarded gap beneath Aaron's raised arm. She didn't think. She never did, in the moments that mattered. She threw herself sideways into him, shoving him hard off his horse and out of the arrow's path. The arrow found her instead. Pain exploded through her shoulder, white and total, and she was on the ground before she understood she'd fallen. Somewhere above her, Matt's roar tore through the mountain air. Not a man's shout, but something older and far more furious. The kind of sound that made every warrior in the column flinch. She had never seen him shift before. She would remember it in fragments for the rest of her life. Armor splitting at the seams, the terrible fluid violence of bone rearranging itself. A king folding down into something with claws. By the time she managed to lift her head, the king of Blackthorn was gone, and in his place stood a wolf the size of a bear, black as pitch, already tearing up the slope toward the rocks where the shot had come from. What happened on that ridge, Bianca never saw clearly. She heard it, a scream cut short, the wet violence of a hunt finishing what it started. And then Matt was crossing back down the slope on 2 legs again, blood on his hands that wasn't his own, his face a mask of something too dangerous to be called fear. He reached her before the poison finished spreading past her shoulder. "Don't you dare," he said, gathering her up like she weighed nothing at all. "Don't you dare close your eyes." She wanted to tell him she hadn't been planning to, that she'd survived worse than an arrow, that he didn't need to look so much like the world was ending. The words wouldn't come. Neither would much of anything else, after that. Only the sway of being carried, the cold, and a darkness that kept trying to pull her under no matter how hard she fought it. He carried her the rest of the way to Blackthorn Keep himself, refusing every offer to relieve him, while Bianca drifted in and out of a fever that turned the mountain trail into something formless and burning. Aaron rode the last stretch in silence, staring at his own hands as though he could still see the arrow that should have found them instead of her shoulder. He kept replaying the moment, her body instead of his, her scream instead of his silence, and could not make it make sense. She owed him nothing. He had humiliated her in front of his entire kingdom, called her unworthy in front of every noble house, and still she had moved faster than thought to save the brother of the man who'd rejected her. He didn't have an answer for why. That frightened him more than the arrow had. For the first time since the night of choosing, Aaron found himself wondering what exactly he had rejected, and what it said about him that it had taken her blood on the snow to make him ask. The healers worked through the night, cutting the poison-blackened flesh from around the wound, forcing bitter drafts down her throat that did as much to make her retch as to help. One of the eldest, a woman who had served 3 kings, finally admitted what none of them wanted said aloud. "The poison is old magic," she said. "Wolfsbane, cut with something worse. I've slowed it. I cannot promise more than that." Matt didn't leave the room again. He sat beside her bed through the night and into the next day, armor still on, blood still dried along one gauntlet, refusing every servant who came to relieve him and every general who came to remind him a kingdom still needed running. "My king," one of them finally dared. "You cannot sit vigil over a scout while the court." "She is not a scout." Matt didn't look up from her face. "She is the only reason my brother is still breathing. Get out, or bring me a healer who knows more than the one already in this room." The general left without another word, and Matt stayed exactly where he was, watching for a breath that kept threatening not to come. The fever broke on the 3rd night, and Bianca woke to firelight and the specific ache of a body that had spent days fighting a war it hadn't chosen. Matt was asleep in the chair beside her bed, still in the same clothes, his head tipped back at an angle that would leave his neck aching for a week. She watched him for a long moment before he woke, as if she needed proof he'd actually stayed. His eyes opened like a soldier's. Instantly, fully, no drowsy transition at all. "You're awake. You look terrible. You nearly died. Forgive me for not dressing for the occasion." It was the closest thing to a joke she'd ever heard from him, and something in her chest loosened at the sound of it. He nursed her back to strength over the days that followed with the same quiet stubbornness he brought to everything, changing her dressings himself rather than leaving it to the healers, reading her the border patrol reports so she wouldn't feel useless lying still, sitting close enough that she stopped noticing the distance between them at all. Once, half asleep, she caught him watching her the way a man watches something he's afraid will vanish if he looks away too long. He didn't explain it, and she didn't ask. "You didn't have to do any of this," she told him. On the 4th evening, watching him rebandage her shoulder with hands too careful for a man built for war. "I know." He didn't look up. "I wanted to." It wasn't an answer to the question she'd asked twice now. Once on a mountain, once in a war room she'd never actually asked it in. But it was closer than anything else he'd given her, and for the moment, it was enough. Aaron came on the 5th day, alone, without his usual armor of confidence. He stood in the doorway like a man not sure he'd be let past it. "I wanted to see you were healing. I am. I also wanted—" He stopped, started again. "I've spent 5 days trying to understand why you saved me. I still don't. But I know I don't deserve to be the reason you were bleeding in the snow." He swallowed. "I'm sorry, Bianca. For the courtyard. For all of it." It was, she thought, probably the first true apology he had ever given anyone in his life. Some smaller, unhealed part of her wanted to feel triumphant hearing it. Instead, she just felt tired. The way she imagined people felt after setting down something heavy they'd carried so long they'd forgotten it had weight. She let the silence stretch long enough that he shifted his weight, uncomfortable. "I don't hate you anymore," she finally said. "I simply no longer need you." Aaron flinched like she'd struck him, which was somehow worse than if she'd shouted. He nodded once, said nothing else, and left her to the fire and the mountain view, and the king who'd chosen to stay. Meanwhile, in a chamber far from the sick room, shutters drawn against any ear that might be passing in the corridor, Lord Varric poured 2 glasses of wine and offered neither a toast worth trusting. "The king grows careless," he said, setting 1 glass before Lady Lisa. "A war won on a scout's advice, a brother humiliated before the entire court, and now he sits vigil over her like she's already crowned." Lisa's fingers tightened around the stem of her glass. She was supposed to be an embarrassment he'd tire of within a week. "She is not tiring anyone. She's replacing us." Varric's smile held no warmth at all. Matt's strength has always rested on the court believing he cannot be moved. If that belief cracks, then he cracks with it, Lisa finished. Varric raised his glass, and after a moment, so did she. To a king, he said, who forgot that even mountains fall. 3 days later, a steward cleaning Lord Varric's private study for a visiting envoy found a folded letter wedged behind a shelf, half burned, its wax seal cracked but still legible. She almost threw it into the fire with the rest of the scraps. Then she saw the words that hadn't quite burned. The poison must not be traced back to the arrow. Her hands were shaking by the time she reached the guard captain's door. The letter went straight to Matt, and he did nothing about it. Not yet. Varric is careful, he told the guard captain when Bianca pressed him days later, once she was strong enough to be pressing him about anything. Corner a careful man too early, and he burns everything else with him. We wait. We gather more. She didn't like it. She agreed with it anyway. By the time the Winter Moon Festival arrived, 3 weeks after the mountains had nearly taken her, Bianca had healed enough to stand through an entire evening in the Great Hall, though her shoulder still ached in the cold. The hall itself had been transformed for the occasion. Silver banners alongside the wolf standards, candlelight multiplied 100 times over in polished stone, the whole castle smelling of pine and spiced wine and old tradition. The court had spent those 3 weeks deciding, collectively, that a recovering scout would make an easy target for one final humiliation before the old year turned. The invitation arrived on stiff cream paper, a surprise formal dance, the kind with steps so old and precise that only nobles raised in ballrooms since infancy could follow them without stumbling. Bianca understood the trap the moment Mira translated the dance's name for her. It was built to embarrass her in front of every visiting dignitary from 3 kingdoms. She spent 2 nights learning it anyway, not from a dance master, but from Mira humming the count in the kitchen while Bianca moved through the steps in her boots, memorizing the pattern the same way she memorized a trail through unfamiliar country. Her feet knew mud and ice and loose scree. They had never once been asked to know silk floors, and by the second night, they finally agreed to learn. By the night of the festival, she danced it perfectly. Matt didn't dance. He never had, the court whispered, not even at his own coronation. But when the final steps ended and polite applause rippled through the hall, more startled than warm, he crossed the floor and took Bianca's hand in front of everyone, leaving no doubt at all about where his loyalty stood. That was when Lord Varric decided the moment had come. A charming performance, he said, loud enough to carry, stepping into the space Matt had just claimed. Though I wonder how much of it, the dance, the war council, the king's devotion, is performance at all. A woman climbs from a border hovel to a king's bed in a single season. One does wonder what she's bewitched him with. The hall went silent in the particular way that means everyone is listening twice as hard. Bianca felt the old flinch rise in her, the same one from the courtyard, the one that wanted to shrink and disappear. She let it pass through her instead of staying. I didn't bewitch anyone, my lord. Her voice carried without her needing to raise it. I tracked raiders through winter for 8 years, so villages you've never visited could sleep at night. I read a valley correctly, when your own generals would have marched 500 men into their graves. I took an arrow meant for the man who rejected me in front of this entire kingdom, because it was the right thing to do, not because it would earn me anything. She turned slowly, so every noble in the hall could hear her. You call it bewitching because that's easier than admitting the truth. Strength isn't inherited. Her eyes found Aaron's, briefly, before moving on. It's earned. Every scar, every hard winter, every time you get back up after the world tells you to stay down. I didn't inherit anything from anyone. I earned every inch of ground I'm standing on. For one breath, nothing happened. Then, near the back, one of the warriors who'd marched with her over the mountain struck his chest with his fist. The old salute, the one given to a commander, not a curiosity. Another followed, then another, until the sound rolled through the hall like distant thunder. Warriors who'd once mocked her, now hammering their approval into the stone floor. Varric's mouth opened and found nothing worth saying. Aaron stood very still at the edge of the crowd, watching the woman he'd rejected be crowned by acclamation in everything but name, and understood, with the particular clarity that only ever arrives too late, exactly what he had thrown away. Later, when the hall had emptied and the fires had burned low, Matt found her on the same balcony, where he'd once taught her to read a column of marching men. The northern mountains sat black against a sky gone clear and star-crowded. The same mountains that had first tried to kill her and then made her a soldier. "You didn't need me tonight," he said. "You didn't need me at all." "No." "Then I'm only going to ask this once, and I want the truth." He turned to face her fully, gold eyes steady in the dark. "Will you stand beside me? Not because fate tied us together, not because a bond snapped taut in a courtyard neither of us chose, but because you choose to?" Bianca didn't hesitate. "Yes." The winter moonball arrived on the festival's final night, and Blackthorn Keep had transformed itself one last time. Every torch doubled, every banner freshly dyed, the great hall filled with enough silver and candlelight that the whole room seemed to glow from within. Frost had been coaxed into lace patterns across the high windows, and long tables groaned under enough food to feed the border villages Bianca had grown up in for a month. Every noble house in the kingdom had come, along with envoys from 3 others, still trading whispers about the scout, who danced a court measure to perfection, and humbled Lord Varick without ever raising her voice. None of them were prepared for what came through the doors an hour into the evening. Bianca wore midnight blue, reinforced beneath the silk with fine silver chain, a gown made for a queen who might need to fight in it. Her hair was braided back the way she wore it on the northern trail. No jewels, no borrowed elegance, only herself, dressed for exactly who she was. The hall went silent. Lisa's composure did not survive the sight of it. She reached for her wine and found her hand unsteady, and the noble beside her noticed, and by the time the murmuring started again, it was already circling away from her instead of toward her. Matt crossed the floor to meet Bianca, but before he reached her, the great doors opened again. Guards this time, and the guard captain himself, carrying a folded, half-burned letter that had traveled from a hidden shelf to this exact moment. "My king." His voice carried the length of the hall. "We have a full confession from the courier who carried Lord Varick's letters to the border. The poison on the arrow that struck your queen came from his hand." Every head turned toward Varick. He didn't run. There was nowhere left to run to. He simply straightened his collar, as if dignity might still be salvaged, and said nothing at all as the guards took his arms. "Take him to the tower," Matt said. "The court will decide the rest." Into the silence that followed, Aaron stepped forward. He had rehearsed nothing. Bianca could see that in the way his hands opened and closed at his sides, in the long breath he took before he found the words. "I rejected the greatest woman this kingdom has ever known," he said, loud enough for every noble house to hear it, "because I mistook her strength for something beneath me, when it was always the thing I lacked." Then he knelt. No one had commanded it. No law required it. He simply lowered himself to the stone floor in front of the entire court, by choice, and stayed there until Bianca found she could breathe again. Matt reached for her hand. "The moon goddess tied us together on a night neither of us chose," he said, his voice carrying to the furthest banner in the hall. "But that isn't why I'm standing here tonight." He lifted her hand to his lips, eyes never leaving hers. "Not because fate demanded it, because I choose her." He marked her then, before the entire kingdom, and the moment his mouth touched her throat, something older than either of them answered. A warmth that swept through the hall like sunlight breaking through winter cloud, gilding every face turned toward them. One by one, then all at once, the kingdom bowed. Nobles, warriors. Even the flames in the torches seemed to bend lower, as though the goddess herself had leaned down to see. Bianca stood in the center of it, the girl who had once knelt on frost-bitten stone believing a public rejection was the end of her life. She thought of the courtyard, the laughter, the 4 feet of empty stone between her and a prince who couldn't look at her mud without flinching. She thought of the valley she'd read correctly, the captain she'd put in the snow, the arrow that had found her shoulder instead of Aaron's ribs. None of it had broken her the way it was supposed to. It had built her instead, one humiliation and one victory at a time, into someone a kingdom would kneel for. She understood now that the rejection had never been an ending. It had only ever been the beginning. The moon goddess had never made a mistake. She had merely led Bianca past the prince who desired a queen of silk, and into the arms of the king who recognized a queen forged in iron. If you enjoyed the story, let me know in the comments. Your voice decides what I write next. Don't forget to subscribe if you want more moonlit love stories like this one.